Okay, a warm welcome to everyone. I'm really delighted to see so many faces in the live Zoom room, old friends and new friends. Welcome back. This is a new season, our first MLE Friends webinar of 2025, and we could think of no better speaker for the evening on no more pertinent topic than Venerable Ven Losang speaking on participatory sense-making in a world on edge. So as many of you know, these MLE Friends talks are really curated for the MLE community, and we try to include really a wide range of speakers, researchers, contemplatives, philosophers, scholars of a number of different backgrounds each season. And we really try to prioritize an in-depth discussion with a small online community. So this is a very sort of special series, and it's really nice to see many of you here this evening. And I'm looking forward to the discussion in the second part of the evening. And so before I pass the baton to our speaker, Venerable Ven Losang, I'd just like to introduce him formally, and then we will get started. So as many of you may already know, Venerable Ven Losang has dedicated nearly 4 decades to practicing Buddhism and has served as a bhikshu in the Tibetan tradition for the past 18 years. Prior to his ordination, he worked in diverse fields such as palliative care, technology, refugee organizations, and commercial management. His extensive training includes 10 years of studying Buddhist philosophy and practice in monasteries across France, India, Nepal, and Myanmar. Additionally, he spent over 4 years in retreat, immersing himself in Tibetan Sutra and Tantra, as well as Burmese Theravada forest tradition. For the past 15 years, Venerable Gendun has taught worldwide, sharing his knowledge of Buddhist philosophy, psychology, and meditation as a member of the FPMT, which is the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Beyond his Buddhist affiliations, Venerable Gendun serves as an interreligious canon at the Peace Cathedral in Georgia and teaches at the Mevlavi Sufi Dargah in Istanbul. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that a bit off. You'll correct me, Venerable Gendun. And in 2023, he founded the Buddha Project, which engages in long-term guidance for Buddhist meditators, including scientific research, art projects, and intercontemplative social engagement. And so this evening, this seems like a really timely and I would even say urgent talk that you'll be giving. So the title of your talk is Participatory Sense-Making in a World on Edge. So thank you, Venerable Gendun, for offering your time and your wisdom. So no further ado, I'll pass the baton to you to get us started.
Thank you, Johanna, for that generous introduction. And how much of a privilege it is to be in this community again and to share some thoughts together. Yeah. And by the way, Happy New Year. Sorry, I just come out of retreat, so all the Happy New Years take place a month later, as they would do for others. Yeah. The topic I want to share with you actually came from my earlier discussion with Johanna with regard to something that I'm trying to undertake myself that responds in a way to the mission statement of Mind and Life Europe as it was formulated, how we build community and how we make a difference in this world. Personally, for me, this comes from this need to talk about this comes from different directions. On the one hand, I teach a contemplative community, and for me, embodied practice in the world is as an essential aspect of contemplative practice as sitting on one's cushion. The development of compassion, or bodhicitta, as they would call it in Mahayana Buddhism, the wish to become enlightened for the welfare of all living beings, obtains substance by engaging with the world. I think that that we need to engage with this world has never been also more pertinent than today. When you open the newspaper, it is clear that it is time to roll up our sleeves and show what we are made of. And that brings me actually to a second aspect, is that on the one hand, I noticed that we all do important things but sometimes we can be quite disempowered by the fragmentation of our communities and our activities. We all reach a certain group of people, but our overall impact can be quite relative because we're all overburdened by our agendas. And so I struggle with it. I've been struggling with this need for quite some time to find collaborative relationships to make a bigger impact. At the same time, one of these sort of seemingly logical platforms, in my case, to do that would be interreligious dialogues. And I must say that these are so underperforming that almost all of my colleagues have backed out of participating in them at all. And so I've been thinking for a while about what I would like to see, and that, I guess, is the topic of this evening. That comes with a few caveats. I'm no great scholar. I always think that as a younger person, my ambition was to become like a village priest, and in many ways, that's still my take on spirituality. I'm not going to be comprehensive neither this evening. I think on the one hand, that is impossible. I mean, the amount of challenges that we face and the intricate ways in which they're interrelated is incomprehensible for a single person. But more importantly, I will argue this evening that it is even undesirable to give comprehensive answers. I think what is very important is that we come up with answers together. And the world is not devoid of solutions and meanings. I think increasingly the problem is that we don't share them. We are increasingly lacking a shared narrative that binds us together in a communal direction. So to make a little bit clear what context that it has, so I run indeed a contemplative platform, the Buddha Project, that I'm a former project manager. That is why everything I create is called a project. It's a practical term. And one of the sub-projects, one could say, of the Buddha Project is called the Burning Bush Project. And I think it is a term that suits our time quite well. On the one hand, I wanted to take something that is connecting to another tradition, of course, comes from the story of Moses, that is very dear to me. But at the same time, it also quite, it points the finger at, for example, our environmental destruction and so on. The point of the Burning Bush Project is to find other colleagues in the field that are both contemplatives and do things in the world. Not just to meet and to talk, but to collaborate in each other's initiatives, to be seen to each other and by each other's communities, and thereby reach a larger group than we would do on our own, and thereby to empower those that we train ourselves. And that is why, as Johanna highlighted, I'm both very active in Tbilisi with the Peace Cathedral, so a Christian environment. I teach on a regular basis in Istanbul in the context of a Sufi environment. Not from the perspective, as we will see in a moment, from like we're all one or so on and so forth, but really that to stand next to each other as different traditions and to engage with the world and to engage in each other's initiatives is so important. And so I do work with the bishop in terms of refugee care in Georgia when it comes to people that have fled Armenia and people that have fled from the Ukraine and so on and so forth. And I do the same thing with a number of other different spiritual teachers. But with this introduction, I actually made some slides in order not to get lost in this evening, because as you might know what I'm talking about when I say that in the beginning I had nothing to say. By the time I had some words on paper, I had way too much to say for this single evening. So I'll do my best to give some overview of where this is going. But also that will be a good reason not to be comprehensive or not to expect from me comprehensiveness. Another final caveat is this is my first PowerPoint presentation ever. So I discovered yesterday the function of this program. So yeah, if you think this looks like really, really bad, and you know what it is. Yeah. Anyway, And so the main idea was to talk a little bit about participatory sense-making, the world on edge, but then from that perspective of the Burning Bush Project, like in a context of contemplatives that roll up their sleeves in the world, what would be a new way of dealing with each other? And yeah, that is what I would like to explore to some extent, that we have time this evening with you. But before else, as a Buddhist practitioner, motivation is very important to me. So I would like to share with you for a moment where my motivation comes from as a follower of the Buddha. The heart of the Dharma is often phrased in terms of four, what I call four seals, four principles. But I would like to list them in a way that is pertinent for this context, for this community of Mind and Life Europe. And so instead of saying that all things are impermanent, for me it means that life is an unfolding into openness. In other words, to be alive means that we are new in every single moment, and we unfold as all living things do into an open future. And we will come to discuss why I think that is such an important point, not to confine each other and ourselves into preconceived ideas. The second aspect that for me is so important is to state that to be alive is to be groundless and interdependent. We, according to the Buddhist, to the Buddha, we don't have an essence that would alienate us from the world. Our existence is by necessity interdependent. As I often say it myself, is to be alive is to be part of the web of life, or to be empty is to be full of others. And then the third, I think the third point is so important, that not to see that, so to have a phenomenological blindness with regard to these facts, is the root of all suffering. And the Buddha argues very, I think, convincingly, that all our anger and our jealousy and our desire is bound up with a misunderstanding of these two initial principles. And finally, so to come to see things as they are brings not only peace, but it also frees our capacity to care for each other's and each other's unfolding, because we are interconnected by very definition. The unfolding of the other is bound up with our personal unfolding. In other words, to use Hannah Diago's and Ezekiel Di Palo's sentence, life is participatory sense-making by its very definition, as far as I'm concerned. Then I want to share you for a motivation one sentence, and that is, I define that in being helped by Donata Schuller, because I've been struggling a lot with what that word freedom means, that is so important in many spiritual traditions. But just to give it to you, and I hope that the rest of the talk will give you some idea what these sentences mean to me. As for me, freedom is a commitment to life, because I'm part of that life. It is an ethical restraint from imposing unskillful and reifying concepts that restrict oneself, others, our shared world, and our evolution of understanding, alienating us from the wonder and the groundlessness that characterizes life and living beings. It seeks to create a shared, open-ended space in which each is invited to cultivate letting go, discover being without a center, experience aliveness, a mutual transparency, and experience an agency in interdependence that nurtures mutual unfolding. So that is the basis on which I stand in this process that I try to set up with people around me. So this is a description that you find in the that was posted by Mind and Life. So I will skip that for a moment. And so go to a specific challenge that I encounter as a contemplative teacher myself. And so to look at the current challenges that we have from that specific perspective. And I think one thing to take hold of by the wisdom traditions, and you will see in a moment why I'm so careful with this terminology here, is that an important function of wisdom traditions in a broad sense is that provision of shared narratives, to tell stories that bind communities together in an ethical sense, that provides a sense of morality, that protects against violations, and that creates or shapes a shared sense that allows us to collaborate and to survive as individuals. Because as the second point says, obviously, as living beings, as biological beings, we are very vulnerable to all kinds of circumstances that we can't control. And so for that, as vulnerable beings, we rely on our social fabric to be shielded from these vicissitudes. And when this shielding, this social fabric that is supposed to shield us, unravels, as it seems to be doing all around us, then this is for sure also at least a problem of shared meaning. And that, of course, is an obvious problem in our day, that is a restatement of the problem of polarization. We all end up in all kinds of echo chambers that don't intercommunicate anymore. Yeah. A point that I wanted to intersect here as well is that in a general sense, but specifically in a Buddhist sense, meaning is always participatory. Our meanings are built up from words, from concepts or conventions. They have a context, they have logical structures, narratives, identity structures, and so on and so forth, that all are sourced by us from our cultural pool. And so even to the extent that we talk about the autonomous individual, then that autonomous individual, and I think that is something important to stress, because that is the ground from which we take responsibility. But still, when we look at what it is to be an autonomous individual, then still that as an autonomous individual and the way we perceive ourselves, that is still built up from bits and pieces from our cultural context. I think that was to some extent always obvious when you look at the great wisdom traditions of the past. But increasingly, our hyper-individualism, identitarianism, consumerism, and so on and so forth have started to obscure this fact, have rendered the individual separated from its context. Of course, there's much to say about it, but I think for me, the important problem here is that at a time where we face global challenges, because our technology allows us or facilitates us to make, to have a major impact, both in positive and in negative ways. That where now that our challenges are global, we are increasingly losing the capacity for that participatory sense and solution making. We are no longer capable of talking to each other. And I think here is where the wisdom traditions, as far as I'm concerned, have a major role to play. And because for living beings, as the fourth point said, narrative, meaning, social cohesion, and so on are as important as food and drink. Yeah. So if we don't address that, and I think that is often a problem with progressive movements, that they are very technologically or solution-oriented, but fail in describing narrative context in which this can take place. Yeah. For me, also an important point for this whole setup is to develop ways, not on the one hand, to understand the deeper structures behind what is happening, like why is there so much resentment, nationalism, and so on and so forth, because we have a habit of just criticizing it and condemning, judging other people's from holding that rather than understanding it. And I think that is very alienating. That is self-serving. These are forms often, I think, we often suffer from self-righteousness, and that is the best way not to communicate with the other that we want to talk to. So, of course, we need to be able to condemn those that use resentment as political tools. But when it comes to those people that follow, that feel attracted by these movements, we need not to judge them. We need to listen to them why they are doing that, because they do that because as it performs a function to them. They have a need, and they think that these, from revanchism and so on and so forth, that it does something to them that is of importance to them. And so what I would like to contribute to together with others, is the construction of new narratives. And that is where this participatory sense-making becomes, for me, very important. On the one hand, to accept that this process of social progress is dynamic, context dependent, that it should go beyond just material metrics, but must include spiritual, ethical, and communal dimensions. That the narratives that we create should be robust enough, because no change comes quickly. So they must be robust enough so that they can hold us in our communities through prolonged periods of challenging circumstances. And that involve, very importantly, learning to listen to each other, to really learn to listen to each other, so that the way we define progress resonates with a variety of communities. Yeah. And so, in order not to lose too much time on this, so I simply noticed that because we are so fragmented, we feel often to use the social capacity, the social capital of all these communities that are out there. And I think it is important to make time, even though our agendas are so full, to find collaboration, because only through collaboration do we, on the one hand, really make a difference. Do we create a narrative context in which we can all live? But it is also through collaboration that we are empowered, because as little fragments, we all feel frustrated by our lack of efficacy, one could say. Yeah. When I mean collaboration, I mean to go beyond simple coexistence, but really into, on the one hand, to collaborative action and collaborative sense-making. To promote through that both trust and co-ownership and a pluralistic and flexible network, to counter sectarianism, radicalization, and so on and so forth. So to reshape that idea that that's pretty straightforward fact that as living beings in general and as humans in particular, we share far more than what separates us. Now, when you walk into anyone's house, it is, whether or not they are left or right-wing, progressive or conservative, it is, we share the majority of our lives, and that is so, that has been so obscured. The final point here is also to focus, and I took that from my own work in management, to focus more on a narrative that is process and goal-oriented than problem-oriented. Because problem-oriented is self-deflating, is psychologically, if you overdo that, it's not healthy, but it can also lead to condescending and self-righteous communication, which is not practical. Then, yeah, let me see. I think, given the time, and as I would like to hear some of your questions later on, I will skip the rest for the moment. But so the idea is to create diverse networks and strategic partnerships that empower and allow for a greater impact and visibility. And I think, on the one hand, the Burning Bruce project serves that, but I also hope that for myself as a member of Mind and Life Europe, that it will find its own place within Mind and Life, so that it contributes also to that larger whole. Then, very specifically, I said I was talking about contemplative traditions, and I chose the word contemplative carefully. On the one hand, as a Buddhist practitioner, of course, the headed term in India is Dharma, Tao in China, which is too often translated as religion here in the West, and I think that is unskillful. The word Dharma, when you look, for example, at the Samanapala Sutra that I listed here, when you look at how the Buddha uses it, what it includes, then you find actually a range of thought that is much richer and much broader than the word religion tends to do. Surprisingly, it includes forms of materialism, hedonism, fatalism, skepticism, and both theistic and atheistic traditions. And why do I emphasize that? Because if we want to develop new narratives and new shared meaning, then we need to incorporate or bring in all those that participate in that meaning making. That necessarily includes religions and other dharmas, but also should definitely include, for example, as we'll see in a moment, social sciences and so on. I also thought that this word contemplative for me was very important because as Westerners and as Western academics, we have a tendency to impose our own categories, the way we self-define on others, and we should create space for traditions in other parts of the world to define themselves. That is a good practice, I think, within the environment of contemplative traditions, but I think that is also a very useful consideration in a broader context of dialogue between peoples. No, the moment when we use a Western word to understand others, we should be very careful with that because it blinds us as much as it is informative. Yeah. I think the word contemplative also might bring a fresh perspective, as the word religion in the West, of course, is heavily tainted or has a burden to carry from the whole baby boomer problem with religion up till the perceived conservative values of it, its resistance to modern ideas about gender and sexuality and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's true for all religious traditions, but it can be very refreshing both for religious traditions and for others to temporarily escape the confines of that term and to meet together under a different banner that allows us to think afresh, one could say. And I think the word contemplative traditions, therefore, is on the one hand more inclusive of all kinds of other Western traditions, from humanism, Stoicism, phenomenology, and the cognitive social sciences, but also to non-Western traditions that I found actually very underrepresented in these conversations, like the great African tradition of Ubuntu, Taoism, Jainism, and so on and so forth. There is a great wealth of ideas out there that in these contexts are relatively rarely used. I found actually that in his booklet that I got from Amy, Francisco Varela gave a beautiful descriptive term of contemplative traditions, or Tao or Dharma, where he translated as traditions of reflection on experience. It's a very nice one. I think that's a good way to think about this, about the environment that I hope to be able to create with others. The description that I've used myself is that these are views on the phenomenal world, Dharma with a small d, as it is used in India, that have as their aim human and non-human flourishing, and that describe a path, Dharma with capital D, to actualize that view. And that is the interesting aspect in the Buddhist sutras, where the Buddha, even with regard to those traditions that he doesn't agree with, does acknowledge that they have this as their aim. And that is, I think, a good place to start, because it helps us define a common goal. Our common goal is human flourishing. And to find each other in that common goal, I think, is already very helpful to say, well, that is at least something we share. We are humans, and our needs are very comparable. Then, this is, of course, very important when we talk about meaning making. That meaning says something about the way that we perceive the world. And I took two expressions that I think are very informative for the discussion that is following. On the one hand, the description by Hannah de Jager and Ezekiel Di Palo, where it says, experience an active approach is intertwined with being alive and enacting a meaningful world. And I think it is a beautiful way of stating what I stated earlier, that that what we have as living beings is an experience, and that experience is necessarily intertwined with other living beings, and is therefore is an active enacting of both a world and each other. We are intertwined in our meaning making. Professor Garfield elaborates on that idea when he describes Buddhist ethics as a moral phenomenology. To restate him, as he says it here, is that from a Buddhist perspective, the primary thing to consider when we think about ethics is not necessarily primarily the value of our actions or their efficacy and so on and so forth, but is the perception that forms the basis of our action. How our intent follows our perception. And one of the problems that we have from a Buddhist perspective is that we believe that we see the world as it is, rather than a world that is actively created by the mind. And therefore, if we want to have an ethical relationship both with ourselves and with others, that is important to investigate it is important to investigate in what way that perception is constructed. And so, to use some Buddhist terminology here, but from a Buddhist perspective, our perception therefore is constructed on the one hand by the concepts that we use. And that is why it was for me so important to define that word contemplative, because the words that we use to make sense of our world bring baggage. It is based on habitual patterns, which is another way to talk about karma, our past experiences, the history of our experiences constructs our world. And of course, this is always interactively. We can only exist between others. That means that our conceptuality, our concepts, our words, our ideas, hopes, and dreams, we obtained together with others, and by our using them, we contribute to the transformation of these things in others as well. And so we end up with a perception that on the one hand has a cognitive and more importantly has a profoundly felt aspect to it. And when we investigate the basis for our actions, then that is primarily coming from the way we feel the world. We respond very strongly to that felt sense of the world. And so that's very important as a practitioner of an ethical tradition, to use that word, to investigate. And so as embodied beings, and that is the take that Hannah de Jager has, as embodied beings, perception has an interrelated structure of significance. And so the world, we perceive the world as it relates to us, and who we are also, therefore, how we perceive ourselves, how we identify ourselves is then in relation to that world and our past. And the relationship that implies facilitates our intentional direction. And so if we have a conflicting relationship with the world or with others, then our intent takes the direction of aggressive action, for example, and so on and so forth. This implies in turn that we are the creators of both our own and each other's worlds, or co-creators of our own and others' worlds. And so our sense of the other, our sense of ourselves as the center of the world, and our actions arise interdependently in relationship to each other. And that this is the principle, the mechanics that we use for participatory sense-making. As the next sentence says, the interdependence is the basis for participatory meaning-making, the creation of an appreciation of meaning. Yeah. And this, I think, the final point is for me is so important, is that our individualism is actually, and when you understand these things to be a description of the way things are, then you also understand why our sense of Our hyper-individualism is so profoundly disempowering. Because it disconnects us, it obscures this view of what is actually taking place. And so it is interesting that by accepting our interdependence, our dependent origination, that from that understanding, a true sense of autonomy can arise. Yeah. Just check in for a moment if you're all still with me, or if I'm just happily talking beyond you. Yeah. Okay. Then let's continue the journey for a moment, as long as it makes sense to you. So, taking that as a principle, I thought, then what? So, with that understanding, how do I come together with a number of people to make that happen? And I realized that first of all, we need a framing environment. This I get from theory on ritual, but I don't want to make this even more complicated than it is. But to create almost a ritual environment, as I call it here, a theater of interaction that is conducive to generating and maintaining, on the one hand, a shared felt sense of the world, even if that is temporary or partial. Because if we don't have a sense of that we share a communal world, then communication can simply not happen, as our ideas and concepts and language is related to the world as we perceive it. If our worlds don't connect, we can't talk. So we need to somehow define a common ground in which a conversation can unfold. That shared space cannot be imposed. It must be co-owned. That the participants in that space need to feel that it is theirs, that they have co-made it, and that they are co-responsible for it. And finally, I think this space needs to be sacred in a very important sense, that we realize that this space that we have created is of essence to us, and that the outcome that we pursue by it is dependent on the other participants within that space. And so I chose to first work with the retreat form, because the retreat form brings a number of interesting things. With retreat, I simply mean, well, that's what I do as a Buddhist teacher, is to lead people in meditation. We'll see how this now works, because we will have the first retreat in July, unfortunately coinciding with the Summer Research Institute, to my great sadness. But we will hopefully better our planning next year. But first of all, in a retreat, the interesting thing is that in a retreat, the retreat leader is not the primary figure. The participants are. And so what for me it does nicely in a natural sense is that it turns the gaze of the retreat leaders away from their own needs as individuals, as traditions or institutions, and turn around to serving the participants. Like we want to share something with them. We want to give them something. And I think that's a very nice way, as I stated here, to embody radical love. And that is actually the theme of the first retreat that I will lead with a number of others in southern France in July. That in this coming together, I want to foster a holding environment of friendship. And for me, friendship is here the right word. As a group of individuals who have become implicated in each other's lives and each other's activities. So that we, in a very natural way, overcome habitual competitive and defensive behaviors. Yeah. Friendship also brings, hopefully, the acceptance that whatever the other person is doing is at least aimed at your benefit, even if it doesn't work out that way. So that if misinterpretations do happen, that they are softened by that perspective, so that it doesn't spiral out of control. That rather that misinterpretations at moments of challenges, as the last point actually here says, on the one hand, provide opportunity for new meaning making, but also as a moment of introspection, like, why am I feeling conflictual here? Yeah. A friendship relationship in this context also allows us for the dissolution of fixed identities. If we enter a strange environment that we are unsure about, we feel very fixed and with strong boundaries. And I think when we start off by first building friendship relationships, this allows us to let go of these hard boundaries and enter more in a transparent nature into this type of activity. Yeah. An activity that invites collaboration over self-representation, and that works with, and there's a term from Yogacara Buddhism, where we gently perfume the process instead of controlling it, allowing also for ourselves to be perfumed by others. Perfume as like a gentle sense that that we try to give to each other and that we receive from others. Yeah. So that for me, that is of essential importance, to create like a holding environment in which these things can happen. And I'm really looking forward to flesh this idea out more together with others. And I think this is the whole point. This is a bit of a foundation for my own thinking around this topic, but I hope that the other participants that I will name in a moment will add greatly to it, that this truly becomes ours, and then to invite others to add more to this. So we come to the heart of the topic. So we have now an environment, we have some basic principles to stand on. Then what does participatory meaning going to do here? And so, again, I found Hannah and Ezekiel's definition very useful, where they state that participatory sense-making is the coordination of intentional activity in interaction whereby the individual sense-making processes are affected and new domains of social sense-making can be generated that were not available to each individual on their own. And where truly something new is birthed by the rubbing of different ideas. And so that is my whole hope, that when we become together in leading a retreat with a group of 4 people, that maybe the first day we will still be sort of trying to figure out what is happening here, but that day 2 and day 3 and day 4, more and more, the individual preconceived ideas are letting go of, and people start to respond to each other, and a new story happens. Yeah. To introduce a little bit who these other people are, one of the participants will be Donata Schiller, I think for many of you all too well known. So she will take the philosophical perspective. She will bring in the thinking at the edge method to the retreat. The bishop from Tbilisi will come, and he will bring in some Christian ideas of the sacredness of our world. A rabbi will come from the liberal Jewish community in The Hague, the first atheist rabbi that I ever met. He's an orchestrator of others and who works with refugees, is awesome, and myself. And so a group that is well balanced both in genders and in different traditions, both theistic and non-theistic, and to see how this can interact. And our common topic, as I just stated, will be radical love, a love that prioritizes others. Is that feasible? What would that look like? What actually does love mean? What is prioritizing others? How can you prioritize others without becoming deflated oneself, and so on and so forth. So I hope that in the doing of the retreat, that this clarifies itself. So rather than coming with preconceived ideas, I'm really looking forward to coming to a new, innovative understanding of this that is useful to build on. An aspect that for me also here really matters is that there's often this idea that these great contemplative traditions have sort of self-existed in time, and of course that does not make any sense whatsoever. And the great contemplative traditions, and I like always this idea of ancient India. In India, there was, before the modern era, there was no dominant no dominant dharma, to use that word. There was always a great variety of dharmas that interacted in many both productive and critical and contributing ways. So the interesting aspect of Indian traditions is that they are both highly critical towards each other and at the same time seem to accept that they share a common world, a common cosmology, and that you see even in the art expressions of Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and so on and so forth. They use many of the same imagery that is shared between them. And so I like that aspect of allowing both for a critical aspect while at the same time accepting that we share a world. But to make sense in a participatory way, I think one first needs to learn to listen. What I mean by that is that if our boundaries are too hard, so if we are too self-aware, too defensive, too stuck in our own thought, then we can't listen. We can't be moved by the other person's participation. So if that is the case, then there is no basis for sense-making. And so we need to learn to listen. I think listening for me is also invitation to explore the language of the other. Language, I think we're all too aware of, is a highly problematic vehicle. And we talk to each other, and the fact that we nod at each other suggests that we actually have an understanding. But it is surprising when we explore what we have heard in our dialogues, then that how little often we understand what the other's trying to say. And so I think learning to listen and learning to understand what listening means is very important. And so reflecting on this, I came up with 4 or 5 guiding principles. It started with 3, and as often happens when I talk about lists, they end up being longer. There's a funny expression in my environment that goes as follows: that Christians love God and Buddhists love lists. And so I fulfilled that promise. So 5 guiding principles for listening. What does listening mean? I think, first of all, trying to listen while not imposing one's own categories and beliefs on others. In context of contemplative traditions, this focuses especially on the ideas of exclusivism, pluralism, and universalism. On the one hand, exclusivism simply does not accept the other. One holds one's own truth, and one is the only one to hold that truth. And I think that is becoming quite a popular idea. Pluralism is the acceptance that the other also has some truth to give, but pluralism often renders the other completely superfluous. And because all that is good about the other, your own tradition already has as well. And that means there is no reason to participate. Moreover, pluralism in that sense is also not listening really well. And that is especially true with universalism, this idea that you hear often: all religions are one, and so on and so forth. Here, universalism is often nothing but imposing entirely one's own ideas on top of the other. It also often leads to a form of looking for a common denominator that is so low that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And very importantly, it neuters the critical relationship that different traditions have, because I think, our contributory aspects are as important as our critical aspects. We need to be able to question each other's beliefs, propositions, and ideas. That is the only way we can grow as adults. So when we leave our own categories behind, even deeper, I think the second aspect is a suspension of disbelief. So to listen with an open awareness to the entirety of what the other person is to say. And what I think all of us find regularly in dialogues or conversations with others is that you notice in the eyes of the other that after 3 words, they think that they already know what you are about to say and have already started to reflect on how they're going to respond. But I think, again, it is important to learn to listen and to accept that we actually don't even know what individual words might mean to the other person unless we have a good understanding of the totality of what the other person tries to say. So to take ourselves out of that context and try to enter the world of the other. Like, what happens to me when I place myself in that world? How do I feel? What does that do with my perceived sense of meaning? And so on and so forth. I always, this is one of my favorite practices. When I'm in Istanbul, my colleague there, Sheikh Noor, a female Sufi sheikh, she's the best storyteller ever. And as a Buddhist teacher, I'd end up talking a lot, and I always so much enjoy being there, not having to say anything at all, and just listening to her endlessly tell stories, because losing myself in her stories gives me enormous insight in the context, the world from which she speaks, and I'm so much enriched by doing so. I don't have to accept everything, that is not the point, but I'm enriched by seeing the world from a different perspective. Next, when we start to when we have the whole and we try to make sense of that, I think it is the principle of charitable interpretation is very important. So not to take one's own vision or one's own belief as a starting point, but to say, well, no, I accept that the other person says that because it has maximum meaning for her or him. And from that perspective, accepting that that person speaks from an authentic place, and to explore, like, what is the worldview, the narrative context of what I've just heard? How do the individual statements relate to that context? What associations and implied meaning do I experience when I place myself in there? What is the perceived aim? What is that person trying to point towards to? And an interesting thing, I think, to explore is also how the beliefs of the other person are not necessarily always justified by whatever philosophical means, but that they can be justified by their function. They do something. And so even if you might not agree with a specific belief, it is very interesting to observe what it does to another human being. And again, this Sufi context is for me, in that sense, very interesting, because I'm definitely not a Muslim, but I'm always very impressed by what this Sufi, Mevlavi Sufi environment does to the dervishes that practice with this teacher. And finally, learning to ask open questions. I want to learn more. I don't want to impose my ideas. I want to understand her. And I can only understand in others when I rub with them. And I can only rub with them by having a dialogue. The next point for me that's important is to sustain cognitive dissonance. And resisting, for me, that means a number of different things. And first of all, to resist reducing the unfamiliar to the familiar. Some things really don't necessarily immediately make sense, and they don't have to. I find it thrilling when I encounter something that is entirely new to me and that I don't really immediately know to make sense of, because it opens my mind. And that opening allows for new meaning, new understanding to be introduced in myself. It also sometimes confronts me with my own fears and my own attachments when I feel that it is difficult. But I also find that this openness, more than agreement, both conveys and invites respect. And respect is an important human vehicle for conversation. And my final point was moving beyond oppositional thinking. And what I mean by that is that when engaging with others, other contemplative traditions, for example, we don't necessarily always need to agree with the other person's solutions. But I find it always interesting to explore what these solutions are aiming at. And so to focus on that what I don't want, or that I don't agree with, to find, like, what purpose is it trying to serve? Can we find commonality with our challenges and our objectives? Because we invariably can. And I think that is where a conversation is better started. We so overemphasize on problematic behavior without asking, like, what do you actually need, and then to say, well, actually, I need that same thing. Let's talk about that first. Yeah. And thereby find common ground, that common space. We come back to that point. So then we have that. When we are now listening, and when we are listening, then we develop an environment that starts to have shared words. They might be partially shared. It takes time to grow, and that is the fun of the process. And as I said here, to be alive is to communicate. We necessarily exist between others, and that is, to serve that ocean of ideas is profoundly, well, let's be honest, it's just fun. Yeah. So I come back to the point that all meaning consists of social constructions sourced from a communal pool, that the social is defined by embodied interaction and shifting and emerging levels of autonomous identity and the joint sense-making and its experience, that I lifted from Hannah and Ezekiel's paper. So to define the social on the basis of our interactedness as embodied beings with all the needs that entails. Yeah. On that basis, then, to allow that interaction to develop like a history of correlation. So once you start talking, the other person responds to what you have said. What that response is changes your initial perception, the way you experience your words, and so on and so forth. And on that basis, you respond back, and so on and so forth. So in an interaction, what we are doing becomes correlated, and that correlation develops gradually a history of its own. And by that history, a shared environment starts to take form. And it might have all kinds of different ways of unfolding, as Hannah and Ezekiel state: synchronization, mirroring, anticipation, imitations, and so on and so forth. And some of these are more skillful or useful in some circumstances than others. But the point of that retreat, at least, is, and I hope in a broader sense, that others can use these tools in that way, to engage with the other in that way, and to be aware of how this happens. So, because I think if we are unaware that this is anyway the case, we can become quite defensive when we lose our balance. If we don't know what is going on, and we notice in ourselves that the effects of this process, then we can become quite frightened or apprehensive, defensive, and so on and so forth. It is only when we understand that this happens anyways that we can become comfortable with this process and keep our grounding in this process. So that these interactions interdependently influence in an unfolding way the way participants experience themselves in relationship to the other, in which they experience these circumstances, whether or not they're hostile, collaborative, and so on and so forth, the intent with which they're acting, both inwardly and outwardly, that we have both the dialogue with ourselves and with those around us, and to notice that the felt sense of the meaning of words constantly is transformed with every moment of interaction. Yeah. Such that in this process we become dance partners, as it were. This is one of my favorite analogies for this, because in a dance you have some influence, but if you exert too much influence, then dancing doesn't work. And if you have too little influence, it doesn't work either. Dancing really works when somehow this engagement with each other feels empowering, and where you feel both doing something and being led, held by the other simultaneously. And I think that balance is very empowering. I often think it is always interesting to observe that when we have a profound sense of agency in writing papers, or in running a marathon, or in engaging with others, this to some extent is always selfless. We somehow the dance dances itself, and through that we feel an unrestricted sense of intentionality, or less restricted sense of intentionality. And so in that process, we can invite our partners to allow their orientation to be affected by others, and vice versa, so that we allow the others to be sense makers in relation to us, and so that we, in a relatively unself-conscious way, can engage with that sense making. We can allow it to happen, and we can trust in what we bring to the table to be good enough, to be worthwhile enough, and our friendship worthwhile enough for that process to unfold in an unrestricted way. So the natural unfolding happens, and even when breakdowns happen, that they invite moments of letting go and some restorative ritual, sometimes as simple as saying, sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Yeah. As well, I stated that in the next point, that all real agency is selfless and co-emergent, and I think that is one of the great miracles of life. We would so much like to have an individual, separated, substantial free will in this world, and that, of course, is one of our major downfalls. Agency arises in relationship. Our function is determined in relation to others and to the world around us, and that is always new. We need to discover ourselves in each engagement, in each interaction, and that is such an opening to wonder and to aliveness in every moment, rather than to be bringing a preconceived identity to the table, to discover the other and oneself simultaneously, and to act upon that discovery. As again, Hannah and Ezekiel stated, interaction is no longer reducible to individual actions or intentions, but installs a relational domain with its own properties that constrains and modulates individual behavior. This interaction allows for to become participants in a singular organism. Or in an organism, like in a cell, the individual cell parts have their own functions, but their functions are entirely interrelated. So that aims to engender a context and a process in which both retreat leaders and participants fully and directly participate in a joint process of sense-making, and the whole sense-making activity becomes a shared one. And that is my great hope. So that in this first retreat, but that this happens, I hope that at the end of the retreat we have a whole wealth of new ideas and new insights and new descriptions of both words like radicality and love and all that entails. And that we have this whole thing to take home and to think about for a long time to come, and as a stepping stone to explore that further. But also all kinds of ideas that we can use and deploy, both as retreat leaders in our own individual context, but also that the participants can take this home and use for themselves. Yeah. And so context in a process in which the rubbing of the narratives generates a new participatory story in which words and symbols have novel shared meaning that is mutually understood, and a shared ethical space is formed in which two worldviews find at least a partial common ground in purpose, aim, and conduct. I think the word partial here is important because it is quite okay to keep also one's own space in this. It does not require a complete abandon of one's own context. That is not necessarily at all. We need to find a common space in which we can collaborate, in which we can well, function as living beings, to be honest. So at this first retreat is radical love, and to say something maybe about these words which might be of interest to you. Love in Buddhism is simply refers to the wishing that the other person is happy. Yeah. And I will share with you an expression later on from the Christian and the Buddhist tradition that I think highlights really well. But it is an interesting given that real love, that when love is given, that when one is touched by the other. In other words, when one engages in a participatory relationship with the other in which you your felt sense is influenced by the need of the other, and you yourself, you find yourself responding to that need of the other with a wish that you would like to contribute to it, that this movement itself is also self-healing. It is self-satisfactory. It contributes as much to oneself as to the other. Yeah. The word radical I took from Hannah Arendt, of course, the great German-American thinker, where in one of her texts or interviews, she states that, of course, talking in the context of the Holocaust, that evil, the harm done to others is never radical. It's always extreme. It is always the same. But only love and other wholesome qualities can be radical in the sense that they can be truly innovative, that they can be truly self-transcendent, that they can truly bring us to new worlds. And if we want to make new meaning and new shared environments for each other's benefit, then we truly need to be radical. Yeah. So to restate it, what is the aim, at least as I perceive it for the moment? What would I want from all of this myself? Is that for my own needs, I would like to have a network of thinker-doers that collaborate, participate in, and promote each other's initiatives. So, for example, with the bishop in Tbilisi, I work with him. I'm a canon in his church. I build a chapel in his church. I'm going to think about his temple, his hall of the what is called the Tent of Abraham. I fund his project with refugees and so on and so forth. And that is mutual. He creates space for me to set up a Buddha project there, so that I can also teach contemplative practices in Tbilisi and so on and so forth, so that we together make a bigger difference than we could ever possibly do on our own, and that we are enriched by that participation. But in doing so, we provide hope, trust, and inspiration for all those that are, in this case, in the retreat, but that's all the others that we serve and that we collaborate on our own side with. And because every network that we build shows that we are, let's be honest, when it comes to the central human needs, we are the majority. Most of us just want to have a meaningful life in which the basic needs are provided, where we have friendship and some kindness around us and some peace and justice. And I think we need to make that visible. As it is often said that extremist movements always try to empty the middle ground. And I think it is for us necessary to stand in that middle ground and hold our hands and to see that it is still there. And that is the space where the majority of people are living. Do that to empower leaders and communities alike through reinforcing networks and innovative thought, so that we don't always have to invent the wheel ourselves, but that we can talk to each other like, how do you do that? To encourage participants to maybe join or co-own these projects or develop their own and add to that whatever we are doing. Develop new ways of communication that invite listening, feeling, questioning, and connecting rather than polarizing and condescending speech, which I think we suffer from a lot. And to promote mutual care, diversity, and a shared sense and world making as an alternative to debilitating conflict, as we are seeing it so much in our newspapers at the moment. Yeah. In other words, I need a context to be able to roll up our sleeves and not be passive bystanders in what we are observing today. That brings me to my final slide, and these are two quotes that I found very inspiring and remind myself of on a regular basis because they are of astounding beauty. And where on the one hand, Bernard of Clairvaux says, love alone is sufficient unto itself. It is its own end, its own merits, its own satisfaction. It seeks no cause beyond itself and needs no fruit outside of itself. Its fruit is its use. And I think you could not define love in a better way than this. Love is true love is necessarily not reciprocal. Its use is its fruit. The Lama Chepa, the central practice of my own Tibetan tradition, the Lama Chepa, the offering to the spiritual friend, states, in brief, infantile beings labor only for their own ends, while Buddhas work solely for the welfare of others. Discerning the disadvantages of the one and the advantages of the other, I seek your inspiration to be able to equalize and exchange self and other. And so when I come to this table, in this case with you, the MLE community, in the context of this retreat and the Burning Bush project with Donata, Malchas, and Marianne, I request their inspiration to be able to do exactly that. That's together, strengthened by each other, that I can truly prioritize others over myself and be the prime benefitor of that process. So that was a lot of words, and I managed to keep an entire 15 minutes free for questions. Yeah. I hope that made some sense. To be honest, I just used the occasion to start working on a mission statement, like a ground foundation for this whole Burning Bush project. And this document will go to Donata, Malchas, and Marianne for them to add and to change and to transform this. And I think hopefully every iteration of the things that we do together will help this to grow and to find new wording and so on and so forth. Let me check for a moment what it says in the chat of Father Francis. States it is so interesting that you have a special relationship with Tbilisi in Georgia. Oh, yeah, that's true indeed. Yeah. It's always fascinating that the Buddha is also a Christian saint, Josephat, indeed. Yeah. Here we are. And some say that Jesus is buried in India. That's the way all things work. Yeah. And indeed, I think also actually from our own traditions, I think, and that is interesting in the Father Francis has to say, I also find in the way Buddhism is used in the West, we over-focus entirely on philosophy. But if you have ever lived in Asia, you know, when you live in, I lived in Burma for a while, the primary vehicle for Buddhism is not philosophy at all. There's very few people that open the Abhidharma ever. This is, monks do that in their free time. No, the vehicle is stories. No, when you go to any Buddhist temple, you don't find a list of like mental factors. You find all these stories of the previous rebirths of the Bodhisattva. Yeah. Yes, Laura.
Hello, Bante. I'm so happy to see you and hearing your talk. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I really enjoyed, especially when you were providing this suggestion about framing the environment and then also the list about the listening. So I found them extremely helpful and useful. And but I have a question that maybe it is a bit more, in a way, theoretical, but I think that has to do also with the experience and the practice, because I found kind of a fil rouge in your talk that had to do like finding this common ground in the purpose or in this aim where we have to go. And also at the beginning, you were speaking about, having this goal-oriented language instead of problem solving and stuff like that. And I see your point, and I know that this could be extremely beneficial, but sometimes I find also problems in that when precisely more when we think in terms of goals, that the goals are part of this problem solving or performative, activity or activism. So my question, that is a real question for you, is how to be more flexible and open also in terms of what are the goals and the aims. Is it even possible to allow a goal to emerge out of the process, or should we have to have it at the beginning? And how could we allow the unexpected to unfold? Also, an unexpected goal, I remain, and also failure. Actually, I'm thinking a lot in terms of failure, So when we have, this kind of activism, how could we incorporate in this goal-oriented process also uncertainties, failures, and vulnerabilities?
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. That's the problem with always when you choose words and you see exactly how important participatory meaning making is, because every word comes with lots of baggage. For me, it came actually from my thinking came from two perspectives. Is that most of our needs, what I mean with needs, is not so much great goals, but very human things in the here and now. Now in interacting with you, I need to feel safe. And that is more what I need, what I mean. So I don't mean like major goals. I mean necessary things for my flourishing here. I remember at one point I was in the United States and I was hitchhiking. And what I really wanted was a ride from one of these major American trucks. And so at one point I sort of blocked like a driveway out of it, like a truck stop. And I stood there as long as finally one stopped for me. And so I got into that truck. And this was the classical example initially of what you could think of like a right-wing redneck. Like initially everything was wrong about this. There was like an NRA piece of paper on his desk that had an image of Bill Clinton being hung in horrible ways. Yeah. He drove me all the way to California. I mean, he drove an entire day. And I decided not to judge him. I mean, for one thing, he was twice my size. So there was like judgment was dangerous. And so I just listened and asked questions. No, and in the end, to be honest, it's a funny story, but I ended up with him crying on my shoulders in the McDonald's, because we ended up just sharing very human needs. So beyond the superficiality of the big things, he was just a guy that also obviously had a lack of intimacy. What he wanted was above all just a friend, and that is why he was part of the NRA, because what radical organizations often offer friendship. And so that's what I mean with need on the one hand. And the other thing comes actually from management, where when you have a group of people that you manage, of course you want to good management is making or facilitating people and expressing the qualities that they have. But what you find is often people get very stuck in the definition of their problems. And that stuckness in the description of that problem can be quite an obstacle of finding a way out, because then you from the problem you get blaming, and you get very problematic discussions. And one technique to use is to ask like, but where do you want to go to? And then in very human ways. And so rather than to focus on the problem, to focus on the path. And that is one of the things that Dharma means. No, we look for flourishing, and to say like, what does that flourishing mean to you? And so at the moment, seemingly that your path to flourishing is blocked in one way or another. And okay, that is what it is for the moment. But to get somewhere, I need to have some idea of what you mean by your flourishing. And so it was that I meant, rather than major goals like keeping the temperature change of our planet at 2 degrees. Yeah. I think often the goals that the way we describe them are so abstract that most people can't relate to them. That is why they fail. That is why so much of progressive politics fails. Because no one, I mean, in the morning when you get up, you don't think about the relationship between fossil fuels being used and solar energy. That's not your prime worry. At least that's not my prime worry when I get up in the morning. That is making coffee. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura,
So
for
that,
that great question. If there's
yeah.
other questions or comments in the room, we have just under 10 minutes, so please feel free to come forward as you have a question or a reflection. And if you can't open your mic, that's no problem. You can drop it in the chat and we can read it out to Ven Losang Gendun.
Yeah, so Bruce highlights, perhaps it might be helpful to emphasize the fundamental point which I have taken from your discourse. It's first necessary to appreciate how we are interconnected to ourselves when we are connecting to others, allowing us to become the change we wish to see in the world. Thus, we start from being, knowing, loving in Vedanta Satchitananda, which in practice represents awareness, recognizing awareness with love. Yeah, I think that is a good point. To be honest, what I find fascinating as a practitioner is that in Buddhism, this idea of non-self plays a major role. And so I live in a way in two interconnected worlds. I live in a world that is within me, and I live in a world that is outside of me, and these are profoundly interrelated. So when I look at my body has that's a world of its own. And it does all kinds of things that I'm not often directly aware of. And my bits and pieces have all kinds of needs and urgencies, as does the world outside of me. And it is indeed a very good point to anchor oneself very well in one's own internal ecology before reaching out to the ecology outside of ourselves. And I think inevitably, in the end, real agency is felt when these two fully interact, when one's idea, one's separated concept of self leaves us, and doing never needed a doer, because that does not make any sense. And because then you end up with the question, how does a doer do the doing? And then you have two doings all of a sudden. When we feel free, then doing is happening. Doing is possible. The doing never needed a doer to begin with. And that doing happens between an internal ecology and an outside ecology. It is the interaction between those two. When you don't know about you, but one of the nice things about sports is that you have no self-awareness when it is really going well. Or when you're writing a text, the text seems to write itself. That is something that happens. Or when you have a wonderful engagement with a friend, then that sort of happens. And it is especially in these moments that you feel extremely powerful. And that's the fascinating thing, that you feel most capable as an agent when that sense of being an agent is not present. Yeah. So yeah, Bruce, thank you for the question.
Yeah, Amy.
Thank you
Yes.
so much. And
Yes, Amy.
Since the word become came into the chat, and I thought it might be helpful because it wasn't in your presentation, but it made me think about, your presentation also made me think about this tenet of participatory sense-making and fundamentally of enactive theory that connects life in the living world to mind, which is this notion of becoming, which is this idea that we start from a point where we see others and ourselves as always being unfinished beings, as Ezekiel de Palo writes so beautifully, and which also is a good way to keep in the space of experiencing rather than move into sort of reifying or substantializing yourself, the other, the environment in some way or another.
Yeah.
So it made me think about your need to define contemplative and the use of that word. And I thought, I was just thinking while you were talking that that it should be a gerund in a way, because
Yeah.
contemplatives aren't always contemplative, but we are contemplative when we're contemplating.
Yeah.
As a psychoanalyst is, once she decides she's a psychoanalyst, and one might then say that that once I'm finished with that substantialization or reification of myself, I've stopped being an analyst.
Yeah. 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 Very valid points. I always think of Whitehead that said we should ditch nouns for verbs. Yeah, I think that's right. But if I would have done that, then this would have sounded very strange. If I would have spoken last hour and 50 minutes using only verbs, then I'm not sure if any of would have followed what I was saying. And with the other aspect, that's why I use the word openness. And so with that openness, unfolding openness, I meant exactly that. And that's what the definition of freedom that I stepped over. I think I put it in there because I would like to start using it. But it is exactly that. That from a Buddhist perspective, our problem is concepts to begin with. Concepts are always reifying, and they, the moment you use it, you have created boundaries, and so we need to use them in a very judicial way, being very aware of their limitations. And so the moment you have described something, it is already become history. It's already no longer exactly true. And I think that is exactly why that whole notion of participatory meaning making and contemplative practice works very well together, because I think that is exactly what happens. Is what you start to observe, that the world is the word I use is constantly, of course, that unfolding, but that means that nothing ever stands still. What you see is constant. Something is made anew by the relationship that it engages with. And that is exactly how we perform functions. And that is also such a nice way to look at the world. I mean, how much neurosis could we not overcome if we could leave the past where it is? The past is the soil in which we stand, but it doesn't exist anymore. We are free to let go of these identity stories. Like, well, yesterday was silly, but I'm not bound by my ethnicity.
It may still exist, but it can be transformed.
I think it is transformed by nature. Because as you know more than I do, is that, my memory of yesterday is not yesterday. My memory of yesterday is already secondhand, and that secondhand is highly problematic. Yeah, nice point. Yeah. I see a quote from T.S. Eliot from Bruce. At the still point of the turning world, there the dance is. Yeah, it's a famous one. Where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor toward, neither ascent nor decline, except for the still point. There will be no dance, and there is only the dance. Exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
So it looks like we're at just about time. I think we'll probably have to end there unless there's a really burning question in the room that needs to come out. I think we could probably go on for another half hour, but we want to respect your time. So I think once again, Venerable Gendun, thank you, an immense thank you from all of us for this really intricate and richly textured, and despite all of what you said, quite scholarly presentation. So and also robust and hopeful in unexpected ways. So thank you for this, and so quite the offering to begin 2025 with, and feels much needed at this time. So a lot to digest, a lot to chew on over the next few weeks and months, and over the next year. So thank you from all of us. And if we were in the same room, we could give you a round of applause.
No, don't worry.
And
No,
on Zoom,
my pleasure was to be
lovely.
among you at the beginning of this year. Yeah, I'm so grateful to see your faces again. And that's where I started. I think apart from me of that community is Mind and Life Europe, to be exact. I mean, it's a wonderful platform for the engagement between scientists and contemplators as making meaning in many different ways together. And so to come out of retreat and then to be able with you is a gift on its own. So thank you for being here, and thank you for giving me the space to present the Burning Bush project.
Thank you. Look forward to following it more over the next year, in years, actually. It'd be wonderful to keep this open as a conversation. And I think before we close, we just have a couple of announcements at the end with an end slide. As many of you know, our online programming is monthly, and so we have new talks every month, but we also have a podcast in case you haven't been able to find it and subscribe. And with this season 2 of the podcast, what we've done is we've brought back groups from our Core in Action semester 4, which some of you may have followed. And so we're really talking with these guests very much in the tradition of participatory sense-making, which you heard about this evening. And so we're covering topics from everywhere from healing to AI to improvising to pedagogy to neurodiversity and more. So we've got 8 episodes coming out. So we'd encourage you to follow on whatever platform you listen to podcasts. And so the next one features 2 incredibly interesting guests, Dr. Luke Steels and Dr. Takashi Ikigami, who will be speaking about really sort of emergent topic, which is an enactive AI possible? And so given the times that we're in, it seems like another timely conversation. And so hopefully you'll tune into that. And we have a contemplative session also every month. So for those who are new to that, this has been going on for the past few months, and it's just it's open to all, open to the public. So you can also share it with friends and colleagues and family members. It's just an hour, some lightly guided practice, so usually sitting practice and sometimes some dialogical practice. So you're encouraged to join us. It's totally free and open to the public. So feel free. And we look forward to seeing many of you soon. We'll keep you posted about our upcoming MLE Friends talks in the next couple months. So thanks again to everyone, and have a good evening or day or morning, wherever you find yourself.
Have a great evening.
Thank you, Ven Losang Gendun. Take care.
Take care.